Dr. Ashajan can start. So Dr. Ashajan is
on behalf of
Dr. Ashajan, your connectivity is very poor. We're not able to make out. So I guess we'll have you on the program as soon as your connectivity improves. We are unable to hear Dr. Ashajan. So I guess, is Dr. Tabassum with us? As yet, not yet. So we'll just go right ahead, and my apologies because I think Dr. Ashajan was a little held up. So she's still in her vehicle, and we will have her in on the program as soon as she's ready to join us. So I hand over then to Dr. Aparna Sharma to start our panel for today. We know it's always special to be with the Raipur Obs and Gynae Society for this series that we set up, really about the essentials of fetal medicine. Yes. And one of the topics that we always have to cover is the TORCH report. And then the first question we're asked is, why did you get a TORCH?
Hello.
So hopefully we should have that answer today. And I hand over the podium now to Dr. Aparna Sharma for taking us through this panel.
So am I audible, sir?
Yes, and we can see your pointer very nicely, full screen, marvelous.
Right. So thank you so much. And I think, as sir has mentioned, TORCH is something that is really challenging for us, because the question starts, as sir said, why did we get it done? So and the topic, of course, is how to treat a TORCH report. So this is really interesting, because do we treat the report or do we treat the patient? So now we will start with the basic questions about why should we be doing TORCH in the first place, and how to go ahead with the TORCH reporting. When we try and understand the infections in pregnancy, there are three types. One which is predominantly fetal affections, and the other ones which cause maternal affections like HIV and influenza, and some which have both fetal and maternal affections like HIV, HBsAg, and HCV. But when we talk about the infections which actually affect the fetus, and this is where we talk about the TORCH infection, classically the TORCH infections. And this is a very beautiful article which actually talks about the role of ultrasound in congenital infections, but it actually comprehensively covers the TORCH infection right from diagnosis to management. So when we want to know about TORCH, what we want to know is, how does it affect the fetus? What is the indication for TORCH testing? What workup should we be doing? And for the mother and the baby? And are there any interventions which are available to prevent and treat the fetal infection? And for this, today we have an esteemed panelist with us. We have Dr. Ashok Khurana sir with us, who's the doyen of fetal medicine in India. We have Dr. Asmita Rathore ma'am, who's the HOD of Maulana Azad Medical College and a very keen interest in fetal medicine. We have Dr. Manisha Kumar, who's a professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Lady Hardinge Medical College. Again, fetal medicine specialist, and Dr. Rashmi Bagga, who's a professor from PGI Chandigarh and with special interest in fetal medicine. So with this team of esteemed panelists, I'm sure we're going to find answers that we are looking for in our day-to-day practice. So beginning with the first case. So this lady was actually a 24-year-old primea gravida who at 28 weeks of pregnancy first, she was a booked patient with us and actually a very well known patient to us. She was following up very normally with us. All her antenatal investigations were normal. Blood pressure was normal. However, at 28 weeks, we found that there was fetal growth restriction with oligohydramnios. Otherwise, everything else was normal, and it was a severe fetal growth restriction. At 28 weeks, however, there was no evidence of echogenic bowel calcification. Now, my first question would be, to Dr. Asmita ma'am that can this be explained by torch infection? Early onset IUGR, Doppler's normal, can this be explained by torch infection? And I would like to have a broader view of things also. We would like to know that what are the possible effects of torch infection on the fetus?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Aparna. At the outset, thanks to Society of Fetal Medicine for inviting me on this panel on a very, very challenging subject, which we quite often face in our clinical practice. Coming to the case, she is a case early onset fetal growth restriction. There is no maternal comorbidity and the Dopplers are normal. So classically, when we talk of causes for fetal growth restriction, we classify maternal, placental, and fetal. So in this particular case, we have ruled out maternal causes because there is no comorbidity. Normal Dopplers rule out practically the placental causes. So the possibility of fetal causes are the predominant etiology probably in this case. Now, when we talk of a fetal causes, again, we have 2-3 common causes. One is an aneuploidy, but the screen as the report that is given shows it's low risk. Though the type of screening which is used is not known. If it's a second trimester screen, probably it may have a less detection rates that we have to keep in mind. Second possibility is an structural anomaly, especially the renal causes where you can also have an associated oligo. But again, there is no obvious structural anomaly in this case. So the possibility of a fetal infection is an plausible cause, and fetal infections do contribute to around 5% of a growth restricted fetuses. Now, next, coming to the possible effects on the fetus. The fetal effects of torch infection is a chain of events. First, it has to be a maternal infection, which can be primary or a non-primary. Non-primary infection can be a reactivation of a latent infection, or it can be a reinfection with a newer strain. Then that infection needs to be transmitted to the fetus, which can be antenatally due to the transplacental route. Again, the rates of transmission varying with the different periods of a gestation. And once the infecting organism reaches the fetus, the severity of an infection in the fetus will depend on the virulence of organism, the timing of a transplacental, the exposure of the fetus, and then also the fetal immune reaction. In general, the primary infection in earlier part of a pregnancy will cause the more severe fetal damage. Now, coming to the possible effects of a torch infection on fetus, it can be teratogenic if it occurs in an early pregnancy and can cause various congenital anomalies. Then it can be disruptive because of a disruption, which can have a various brain damage. Then growth restriction is also possible, probably because of a cell destruction due to infective organism, or it can be because of a placental damage. And then sometimes you do get miscarriage, stillbirths, and of course, there is a neonatal disease.
Right. So thank you, ma'am. And I think the very nicely you brought out the differential diagnosis of fetal infections and how fetal IUGR and how infection could be a cause after we have ruled out the other things. So normally we would not be doing torch, and this is what we repeatedly keep saying. So what are the indications for torch screening during pregnancy? And Dr. Manisha, and which group of pregnant women are at high risk for torch infections?
Yes, so basically, when we talk about torch infection indications, we should remember that there are very few indications, and we should not be ordering torch as such in any case before the indications are actually there. So we have to remember the first thing is this. And when we talk about indications, there are very few, as I said. So one would be like if the patient is having, having pets. So these things would make them more prone to having toxoplasmosis. So this can be there. If there is some association with some patient who is having that infection, so that would be one of the indicators, such as a patient is having rubella association with some rubella infected patients. So that would be one indication. So the other group would be immunocompromised patients. Patient is immunocompromised, they are more prone to having torch infection. And the third would, and the most important part would be some fetal anomaly, if it is there, or if there is some FGR present, as in this case, or if there is some oligohydramnios or polyhydramnios present with some placental megaly. So any ultrasound feature which is suggestive of in possibility of infection
Right. So
would be there.
yeah. So thank you, ma'am. And I think that is a comprehensive thing. One thing is don't do for all unless the signs appear or there is an indication or exposure to that. So thank you, ma'am. And now I would come to a question where it is more controversial. So it is, trying to look at it from the other way around. So in which situation can maternal torch screen be avoided? So it's, we have to catch hold of the concept from all angles. So that is why I'm asking this to sir, that what are the situations in which you should avoid a torch screen?
Yeah, you see that the point is that there are sometimes very obvious situations where you will have a fetal anomaly, which is frequently associated with one of the torch infections. And in that case, the first choice would therefore be an appropriate invasive testing at a particular time, irrespective of what is going on. So if I were to find at 24 weeks, something like what we're finding in this situation, the point is that ideally speaking, I should be doing invasive testing. If the patient does not want invasive testing, then we could offer it as a second step, as a proxy, but not as a straightforward choice. The next thing is if the patient doesn't want to do anything about an infection and she just wants to carry on as is because she feels it's futile to do one thing or the other and she doesn't want to let go of the pregnancy, then you don't do a maternal torch screen. Also, sometimes you have to discuss this with the patient and tell them the limitations, that the torch test has its limitations, the avidity has its limitations, the ultrasound findings have the limitations, and there is limited treatment available. So with that cafeteria, again, the patient might opt out of it. And then if you look at it from your point of view, what if something were to happen tomorrow and I've not done this? Would my so-called judge, who doesn't have a judicial background in the consumer forum, ever accept the fact that I did not do it? So the indication then becomes a non-medical indication, and therefore you end up doing torch most of the time, because you can be asked, why didn't you do it? And a doctor like you and me would understand, a specialist like you and me will understand, but a layperson would never understand.
Right. So I think that's what it is. Sometimes it is clinical practice and sometimes it's like, practical practice. So that is another thing. So, and also what about recurrent pregnancy loss? So we are really troubled. We are really troubled by people doing torch in recurrent pregnancy loss. So what is your opinion on it? I really want a strong opinion on it.
Yes. So it's very straightforward. We have a bad obstetric history, which is things going wrong later in pregnancy. But if you have just miscarriages, there is absolutely no indication for torch and repeat CMV, IgG, IgM, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
There is one straightforward, that we will not use torch in the evaluation of recurrent miscarriages.
Right. Thank you, sir. And this is also coming from what Dr. Asmita told, that it is the primary infection which causes a problem and reactivation is usually not a problem. So if a patient has had torch and she had some miscarriage or something, so it won't happen again. So recurrent pregnancy loss is not something that you can explain by torch. So thank you, sir. And now we move on to your field of interest and field area of specialty, that what are the ultrasound features which you would like to look for in torch. We will be discussing a bit more in detail when we come to individual infections, but an overall picture of what you are looking for in the ultrasound finding to suspect torch.
Yeah. So there is a long list actually of the non-specific ultrasound markers, and they could be in the fetal environment, which means the placenta and amniotic fluid. They could be in the growth pattern, and they could, of course, also be fetal findings where you have to specifically look for them. Now, the question is that we do understand that the placental and amniotic fluid abnormalities are often transient. So you could find in the acute phase a large placenta. You could also find it in the terminal phase when the fetus becomes hydropic. You could find a shrunken placenta, which is highly calcified in a chronic phase of the infection. You could find an oligoamnios and anhydramnios in case there's been a renal shutdown from CMV. But you could also find it when you have a severe chorioamnionitis, because that is the same thing that also predisposes these babies to preterm delivery. And then there is polyamnios. Polyamnios can either be due to an actual acute infection, which results in an exudation. But apart from that, there could be a fetal abnormality, such as bowel atresias that can happen, say, in chickenpox, which can result in a polyamnios. So that would be the environmental abnormalities. The rest of them are basically exudates, which happen into any of the body fluid spaces. In addition to that, the immune response of the fetus in terms of hepatic and splenic enlargements. And then the effusions can be in any of the spaces. And then you can also have echogenic bowel, which is part of the same phenomenon. But mesenteric ischemia, one possibility, and an actual infection is the second possibility. Then you have the big group of growth restriction, which can happen fairly early, depending on when the infection has taken place. And then you have cataract and cranial abnormalities. Cranial abnormalities can be destructive abnormalities, but they could also be disorders of cortical migration. And those actually are, again, non-specific. And then over a longer period of time, you get microcephaly. These are the non-specific signs. But this list is not important by itself. And the list is very specific. For instance, if I find hydrops with an abnormal middle cerebral artery peak systolic velocity, then I know I'm headed for looking for parvovirus. Then I investigate a little differently. So this serves as a pointer that I must include infection as a differential diagnosis in this particular scenario. Or in case on the off chance that the mother has had a history of contact, like my child had cytomegalovirus, then that one possibility, or that she actually has had an infection. Then you say, okay, these become useful. But most of the time, these are primary findings, which we happen to find coincidentally, and then we start the workup.
Right. So I think the investigation for the torch starts from the radiologists or the fetal medicine first. So it's a very important thing to consider, that if we have some typical findings, we should definitely investigate for torch. So I would just like to ask this question from Dr. Rashmi Bagga ma'am, that, what are the various guidelines or the country specific things where, you would routine prenatal screening? Are there any exceptions to this, that, you do routine prenatal screening, and how do you go about it?
It has been mentioned earlier also that we have very clear indications for torch testing. One is ultrasound markers, and the second is a symptom, a flu-like illness. However, also there are certain group of women, for example, in France, where they will do routine screening because they are all dog and cat lovers. So if they have certain habits, like they're in contact with animals, if they're taking unwashed food, as you've shown in the list, etc., then country-specific screening can be done for those women. But generally, we go by the ultrasound markers or by history of a torch-like illness in pregnancy.
Right, ma'am. And what about rubella screening? Rubella, would you like to do?
Rubella definitely. Rubella definitely. In fact, these two things are important. One is rubella, one is varicella. Right in the beginning, we should do their IgG levels to know whether she's immunized or not. Because you get a history of chickenpox, or you get a history of rubella vaccine. So the girls who are coming now, they're of the age when they got MMR vaccine. So in that case, we have that history. We can check their IgG levels to see if they're immune or not. It can be done in the prenatal period. And varicella, of course, because if supposing she's not immunized against varicella and she's come to you, then you have an opportunity to give her the vaccination of varicella before she conceives. And in case she's already pregnant, in that case, you just tell her that you please stay away from anywhere you hear the word chickenpox, because you are not immunized against it.
Right. So ma'am is insisting on the preconceptional part, and that is actually, so in rubella also ideally should be done in the preconceptional period to check that, okay, are you immune or you're not immune? If you're not immune, you can kindly go for vaccination. So what happened in this patient actually is that she turned out to be HSV IgG positive on torch. Yes. So, and are there any clinical implications of this report? I think this is the least important of the torch infections, but ma'am, Dr. Asmita ma'am, what would you, think about this, and how would you go about it?
Yeah, so HSV IgG positive indicates the past infection, and herpes simplex virus after primary infection remains in a neuronal nerve ganglia for a very long period, lifelong, in a latent phase. And there are the possibilities of a recurrent infection occurring in this. So we need to remember that, and there can be even an asymptomatic viral shedding. So one of the important ways how a neonatal herpes occurs will be the transmission of a herpes virus during the delivery. So now coming to the whether it should be treated or not. The treatment can be for two purposes. One is maternal purpose and second is for preventing the vertical transmission during the delivery. As far as mother is concerned, recurrent infection usually is of a milder variety and can most of the cases be asymptomatic. But if she develops recurrent lesions during pregnancy or symptoms in a remaining period, she may need the cyclovir therapy for her symptom relief. Then for preventing the vertical transmission, it is generally recommended that after 36 weeks of a gestation, we can consider the suppressive acyclovir therapy till delivery, because there is an asymptomatic viral shedding in around 0.5 to 1% of cases, and the lesion sometimes may be very subtle. So we should give an viral suppressive therapy from 36 weeks onwards. Second precaution that can be taken is do a careful examination when woman comes to us in labor during delivery to look for any specific lesions or not. And another precaution that can be taken is we can screen the woman for HIV or if there are any associated immunosuppressive comorbidities. This viral suppressive therapy needs to be a little bit preponed to around 32 weeks to prevent the transmission during the delivery.
Right. So thank you, ma'am. And important messages is that HSV gets transmitted during delivery, and it is usually not a cause for intrauterine growth restriction. So if the patient is actually having recurrent herpes, then towards delivery, maybe we would need to give her suppressive therapy to prevent the intrapartum transmission of HSV. So I think that is the important message that ma'am has really conveyed. So with that, we go on to the next case. So this was actually a second gravida, had a previous one abortion at 13 weeks of period of gestation, and she had fever with rash and malaise for 3 days. When she came to the clinic, all other investigations were normal. And when she came, she was IgM and IgG positive. We get such reports all the time that IgM and IgG is positive. So before we actually go on to the serological manifestations and how to interpret that, I would like to ask Sir that what are the usual manifestations and what are the chances of fetal infection, especially at this stage when she's in the first trimester? How would you go about it?
So we know that rubella in the first trimester can be bad news. So we do take it seriously and we try to address the problem and see what is truly happening. Now, in this situation, the mother has had obvious symptoms and therefore we would attach importance and then investigate and make sure what is the degree of fetal involvement. The fetal involvement initially at this stage, when we're very early in pregnancy, may not be apparent. Also, you could have a fetus that has received the virus, that has suffered from the virus and shows absolutely nothing on the ultrasound scan. So that is something that we have to be careful about, that a normal ultrasound scan does not rule out an infected fetus. Beyond that, then depending on a first trimestral infection, we do understand that the manifestation in the fetus can start soon after that. And therefore, we start looking for the manifestations at each stage when the fetus comes to us. You could get a fetal demise, a fetal hydrops with no other findings. And actually, that is a very convenient situation because it involves no decision making. Apart from that, you can get any of the manifestations at any time, which include the non-specific ones like we mentioned earlier. But specifically, also, you can get cardiac malformations, cataract, and cranial findings. And then MRI might yield a few more findings after 26 weeks compared to an ultrasound scan. But the important thing to remember is that if you are clear on all of these, you will still have a risk of sensorineural deafness and developmental delay. So we cannot trust a normal ultrasound alone in this situation. The earlier that the mother gets infected, the worse the chances of the fetus suffering from it. But of course, we know that the later you are in pregnancy, which she's not, then the happier are the chances for the fetus.
Right, sir. Thank you. So earlier the infection, worse the effect is going to be, and later the infection, lesser is the effect. So I would like to know from Dr. Rashmi ma'am that so her report has come IgG and IgM positive. So how would you go about it? And I think this is the biggest confusion. And we will be discussing this with individual infections also. But let us starting with this. How would you go about it, and any other tests that you would advise?
Yeah, so see, these are ELISA tests, and as a rule, IgG reflects an older infection or immunity, and IgM is a fresh infection. That is the rule of the thumb for all of them. And like you had said, if I have counseled her in pre-pregnancy, and if I know she is immunized against rubella, I want to go back to her reports, whether she has IgG at that time or not. Sometimes IgM can be false positive also. So we should confirm any serology test by a paired test done at 10 to 14 weeks, 14 days interval, either after 10 days if she's in a hurry, or 14 days. And if that shows that we have a rise in the IgM titer, it is persistent, or rise in IgG titer also, and it confirms the findings, and it is very early, like it is 13 weeks only. If I confirm this is infection, in that case, we have to take a call based upon the testing. Now, avidity is something which is a phenomena of IgG. Any IgG antibody which has been there for a long time will have high avidity, which means it is an older antibody, so she's immunized. But if it's a low avidity, it's a fresh infection. So if she has IgG of a low avidity, IgM showing a rising titer, a paired test, in that case, I can even go in for termination without any invasive testing, because this is very early in gestation and the chances of fetal rubella syndrome are quite high.
Right, ma'am. So whatever you have said, we are just trying to summarize it here, that if IgM is negative and IgG is negative, that means patient is not immunized, patient does not have a previous infection, so she is susceptible. If, however, IgM is negative and IgG is positive, we are relaxed that it's a past infection. If IgM and IgG is positive, then it's a possible recent infection, as in this case. So as you said, if we repeat the titer and detect a rise in titer, then again, it is supposed to be low recent infection, or if it is a low avidity, then again, it could be a recent infection. And if it is IgM positive and IgG negative, and we are sure of the IgM, then it is definitely a recent infection. And in that case, you can also go for a seroconversion after 2 weeks. And if the IgG from negative becomes positive, it is a indicator for recent infection. So
yeah, Aparna, can I just add here? Torch is so common. I mean, every lay person knows the word torch. So they come with these reports, and they are done at all kinds of labs. So a repeat sample at a reputed lab, preferably after an interval, is important to take decisions such like advising an MTP on the basis of any such report.
Yes, ma'am. And I think that's very, very important. And especially with the case of toxoplasmosis, as we will be discussing as the next case. So yes, so Dr. Manisha, ma'am, so now how do you confirm? So in this particular case, the avidity was low. So how do you confirm a fetal infection?
Yeah, so we have to remember here that this patient is around 13-12 weeks. So there is a difference. Like if the patient is having gestation age of less than 12 weeks, and we have proven that the infection has occurred in the mother, then we don't need to go in for fetal testing. That is important. But if the infection we have detected it later, say around after 20 weeks, or after say later on after 13, 14, 15 weeks, then the chances of infection to the baby is a bit say 40-50%, then we need to do testing in the doing testing in the baby. So for that, then we will do amniocentesis and do PCR. So we have to remember that if the gestation is less, we actually don't need to test, and we can go in for termination, because the infectivity is very high, around 85 to 90%. But if it is later in gestation, then only we need to test, and we need to give some time before we test. So we have to give at least 6 weeks time, and it has to be done around 18 weeks for results. So if we are testing quite early, maybe it will come as negative. So we have to see that also. So that is important.
Right. So I think this is a very, very important point, that if there is a confirmed acute infection in the first trimester, which is demonstrated by a rise or a seroconversion of IgG and IgM positive, so that is something that is acute infection, and there is a high chance of fetal affection. So confirmed acute infection early on in pregnancy, then definitely you might not need. But if there is some confusion and you're late on in the pregnancy, then you can go for the infection. So management, as Dr. Manisha has said already, that mainstay is prevention, and if there is a serious fetal affection, you might want to offer termination of pregnancy. So this is all about rubella infection. But before we end with the rubella, I would like to know that, do we think that this is going to be eradicated in the near foreseeable future?
Of course, but we have to make an effort for it. I mean, we do know that by 2015, the Americas had seen a complete disappearance of rubella. It didn't happen there anymore. So history is a great example. We also know that in European nations, and many of them were free from rubella. Unfortunately, migrant populations in those areas have caused resurgence, but only in that population that was not immunized. So if we take our vaccination program seriously and make sure that no child is left unimmunized, and we'll have to work like we did, for instance, with Rotary and polio, then I'm sure we can find an answer in India as well, because our population loves visiting the hospital on a regular basis, provided we get them into the habit. So for them, it becomes a social event that, today is the polio Shanivar or the polio Saturday or polio Sunday. And that is what we need to do. We need to inspire our population to keep coming and saying hello, and we drop freebies at them, and it will work. I hope it works in my lifetime.
Right, sir. So I think very true, as sir has said, that for our population, actually visiting the hospital is a social visit, and we have to see the ladies decked up in saris coming to the hospital. I think for them, it is also an outing. So yes, I think preconceptional rubella vaccination is another point where we can test it before they actually become pregnant. And if they have received the vaccine, avoid pregnancy for 1 month. If after the vaccine there is accidental pregnancy, there is no need to terminate the pregnancy. So these are some of the important points regarding rubella vaccination. So all women of childbearing age should be advised for testing and vaccination subsequently. So in this patient, it was low avidity and the couple opted for MTP. And as Dr. Manisha said, we did not wait for any further fetal testing, because this is enough indication with a rising titer for an acute infection. So now we come to the third case, where she's a 24-year-old lady with second gravida para-1 live 1 at 33 weeks of gestation. So this lady came to us at 33 weeks of gestation with history and fever and myalgia some 2 to 3 weeks back. And what she has was this finding: with ascites and polyhydramnios, but normal MCA, so it was not fetal anemia, and ICT was negative, so there was no immune hydrops. So this was definitely non-immune hydrops. And we did torch. So when we did torch, the toxoplasma came out to be positive, IgM and IgG positive, and now we have opened the Pandora's box again. So let us now know what about toxoplasmosis. So Sir, I would love to know that, is this report relevant? How prevalent is toxoplasmosis in India?
Yes, we can't. It is prevalent enough for us to take it seriously, because we do understand that cats and household pets are not the only sources. If you look at the reports that we have from the veterinary sciences literature, we do understand that pigs, sheep, goat, cattle are all carriers. And therefore, there could be a large amount of population, including the urban population, where we've learned over the years to actually live together in our homes with cattle living under the same roof. And they could very well be carrying this. And therefore, we would not ignore this report. We have about a 1.45 incidents reported about 15 years ago. But Dr. Sarwan Singh, who's done excellent work at AIIMS on this, says that you have a much higher number of people. So a conservative estimate would be about 1.5 lakh babies born in the nation every year from toxoplasmosis. But a realistic estimate is something that actually approaches almost 4 lakhs. So we cannot afford to ignore this report, but it could be something beyond toxoplasmosis, which means that we have an ascites. We don't have an immune phenomenon here in terms of rhesus isoimmunization. We don't have a parvovirus, but we must anyway investigate.
Right. So thank you, sir. And I think Dr. Sarwan Singh, as you have mentioned, is actually a legend in the field of toxoplasmosis, and he's worked a lot about that. And he still insists in pregnancy also that, there is a lot of significant prevalence. So Now, Dr. Asmita ma'am, so this mother also gives a history of fever with myalgia 2 to 3 weeks back. So how does toxoplasmosis present in the mother and the baby? So what are the features of maternal and fetal affection?
In majority of cases, the toxoplasmosis normally remains asymptomatic. However, a small proportion can manifest with an mononucleosis type of a feature where she will have a malaise, low-grade fever, and sometimes lymphadenopathy.
Right. So this ultrasound feature shows ascites. Could it be attributed to toxoplasmosis? And otherwise, what are the normal, features of toxoplasmosis, congenital toxoplasmosis? This might be a little atypical presentation, but what are the typical presentation of congenital toxoplasmosis in the baby?
Presence of ascites can be a feature of a congenital toxoplasmosis. And the common features of a congenital toxoplasmosis, one will be an CNS manifestations in terms of a microcephaly, hydrocephalus, ventriculomegaly. Then eye involvement in terms of chorioretinitis and cataract is also seen. And there will be an placental thickening. And in a fetus, you can also get an hepatosplenomegaly on an antenatal ultrasound. Then coming to the neonatal features. Okay, we'll go to neonatal features later. Fine.
Right. So, ma'am, I just want you to emphasize the difference between the rubella infection and the toxoplasmosis in terms of the period of gestation. Is there any difference here?
Transmission of a toxoplasmosis is generally transplacentally, and the transmission rates are much higher, are lower in early pregnancy, but the severity of a disease is more. Whereas in the later pregnancy, the transmission rates will be much higher, going to up to 60 to 70%. However, the severity of a disease in the fetus will be much less.
Right. Right, ma'am. So I think this is a slightly difference because the infection is based on the volume of the placenta. So Dr. Manisha, ma'am, so again, I would like you to talk about the serology. How do you interpret serology in toxoplasmosis? And what is like quite important in a case of toxoplasmosis? And is there any role of avidity testing?
So in toxoplasmosis, like first thing is that whenever we advise the test, we must advise both the things, IgM, IgG. So that is one thing. And in toxoplasmosis, we should remember that the IgM level, they generally rise during infection, but they never come to negative. So they can remain positive for some years also, months and years. So IgM level is something like this. And in IgG, it rises. Like if we are going to do the test now, and then we are going to repeat it after 2-3 weeks, they should show a 4-fold rise if it is an acute infection. So in our setup, like whenever we are trying to find out whether the toxoplasmosis has occurred to the fetus or not, the first thing is whether it is a acute and primary infection during pregnancy or not. So for that, we should remember that IgG levels, when the titers will rise after every 2 to 3 weeks, it will become 4-fold rise. So if we'll do the test, we can find that. So that would be one thing. And IgM levels can remain even in past infection. So that these are two things important about toxoplasmosis. And the other thing is that avidity we can do. Avidity, if low, shows acute infection. If high, shows the past infection around 4 to 5 months earlier. So that is the thing. And more than 30% is considered to be a high avidity.
Right. Right, ma'am. And another, just one more thing, very nicely summarized by Dr. Manisha. Just one more thing that I would like to add here, which is specifically very important for toxoplasmosis, is that it has to be done from a reference lab. I mean, it should preferably done from a reference lab. Otherwise, the interpretation becomes difficult. So if you look at the overview of serology, if IgM is positive and IgG is negative, we repeat after 2 weeks. If it remains negative, then it is false positive. But if it becomes positive, that means there has been a seroconversion, then definitely if you have already done it from a reference lab, well and good. Otherwise, we have to repeat it because this could be actual infection. This could be actual infection where you would need to treat this patient. Again, if IgM and IgG are positive, we need to get it done from a reference lab. And then if the IgM is negative and IgG is positive, then definitely it is very unlikely to be an acute infection in the first and second trimester. In the third trimester, it might be a difficult to interpret. So this is an overview. The only thing that we need to know is that toxoplasmosis should be confirmed from a good lab. This is something that we really need to remember. So, sir, coming back to you on the ultrasound and amniocentesis. So, what are the conditions in which you would go for a, what are the features on ultrasound and amniocentesis? How would you, when would you go for amniocentesis?
Yeah. So basically, well, first, the good news that we actually have now the Society of Fetal Medicine guidelines for diagnostic invasive procedures, which have got released with the current issue of our Journal of Fetal Medicine, which is the June issue. And in spite of our COVID troubles, we managed to get the issue out on time. I want to congratulate all the authors there, Dr. Meenu Batra, Dr. Parna Sharma, and the whole team for actually having this ready for us. It contains an excellent step-by-step things, including various checklists, including indications, which are all specific to the procedure and also the overall indications, not generalized. Everything is specific, including the PCPNDT guidelines. So please do look at these in the new issue. It's available online from tonight. And congratulations, Dr. Parna Sharma and the whole team again for this. Dr. Meenu Batra initiated this, and both of you did a fantastic job. So coming to the role of ultrasound, in the initial phases, the ultrasound scan can be completely normal, but we do not then sit back on it. We do understand that the non-specific findings will be there, but importantly, you look for a combination of two types of specific lesions. If you find cerebral echogenic lesions, along with dilatation of the lateral ventricles, that always has an adverse prognosis. And these cerebral lesions with ventriculomegaly are really very characteristic of toxoplasmosis and nothing else. And these can be manifest fairly early in fetal transmission. If you have the echogenic cerebral lesions with no dilatation of lateral ventricles, then they have a far better outcome. In fact, they seem to do pretty well. So this is a very useful pointer. The rest, of course, is all the signs all over again, including the microcephaly and cataracts. When it comes to amniocentesis, amniocentesis would confirm whether it has occurred. We must remember, however, that there has to be sufficient protozoon there, sitting there, producing the stuff you're going to pick up on the PCR. And therefore, at this stage, later in pregnancy, we are likely to get it. The sensitivity of the PCR is actually about 90%, which means that in 10%, the fetus has the disease, but we do not pick it up. But this group where we don't pick it up just means that you actually have lower levels of Toxoplasma DNA in the amniotic fluid, as you put on this slide, and therefore they actually have a much better prognosis of the fetus not being affected. That does not mean that you will not treat. You will then treat on things apart from the amniocentesis, but we must remember that yes, 10% would be negative. And that is how we really do it. Also, that the time gap should be there, that there should be enough of DNA material from toxo coming into the amniotic fluid. So you will need that 4-week gap from the onset of a clinical event.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir. So now this patient's reports came positive for amniocentesis. So how will you manage further, Dr. Rashmi Bagga? I think this is one of the few infections which you can actually treat.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah. So how would you go about
So,
it?
yes. So I'll just take it up that while we were waiting to do the amniocentesis, when we had the ELISA positive and we confirmed that she is having toxoplasmosis, I would like to start her on spiramycin at that time itself, while we are waiting for the amnio. And the amnio will be done, as you said, after at least 4 weeks to get the diagnosis there. Spiramycin 1 gram 3 times a day will be there. And the idea of giving spiramycin to her is to prevent a fetal infection. So in all the torch thing, we have to see 2 things: infection of the fetus and affection of the fetus. So if the fetus is infected now, when the PCR is positive, now my treatment will change. The fetus is already infected. So the spiramycin can be stopped after 1 week, and we have to give different medication to prevent the toxoplasmosis developing in the fetus. So there we have to give a combination of pyrimethamine, sulfadiazine, and folinic acid once a week. Pyrimethamine 25 milligrams BD or 50 OD, sulfadiazine 1 gram TDS, and folinic acid, that leucovorin tablet, 50 milligrams once a week. This has to be there throughout. Spiramycin will be stopped after 1 week, as you have shown here.
Right. So I
And
think
actually, this is continued in the neonatal period also, but I do not know that treatment regimen. Yes.
Yeah. So this patient was actually started on pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine, and for 1 week the baby was on the mother was given spiramycin. The outcome, she delivered at 36 weeks and 5 days, and the weight was 2.5 kg. Neonate was treated with pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine at 25 milligram per kg and leucovorin, and her eye examination was normal, so the baby's outcome was good. So this patient was started on treatment. So I think for toxoplasmosis, the treatment becomes very important, and as ma'am said, there is a maternal infection, so then you start spiramycin. If there is fetal infection, then to prevent the fetal affection, you start pyrimethamine plus sulfadiazine. So I think one of the very important infections is toxo, because you can actually treat it. Now we come to the last big case. I think, sir, we have another 10 minutes left. So in this particular case, so she was actually a primea gravida again at 33 weeks. Everything till now was normal at first trimester. So after first trimester, she was an unbooked patient with us, and she came with ultrasound findings showing fetal growth restriction with severe ventriculomegaly and periventricular cysts. So MRI was done, which also showed the dilatation of the occipital horn of the lateral ventricles, dilatation of the third ventricle, also periventricular hyperintense cystic areas suggestive of gliosis. And then again, there was pericallosal agenesis, partial callosal agenesis also. So with all of these features, we definitely sent the torch again, and this time the CMV came positive. But here, IgG was positive and the avidity was high. So I would now want to take it further from here, that should we be worried about CMV infection? Why should we, what is the magnitude, and why should we be worried about this infection? So Dr. Asmita ma'am. Ma'am, you have to unmute yourself.
CMV is the most common fetal infection seen in around 0.5 to 2% of live births. And why we should be worried about this infection is because this is one infection which a primary as well as recurrent infection is also associated with the transmission and the fetal infection. And it is also important cause of a sensory neural hearing loss in the neonates.
Right, ma'am. So I think one of the most common causes of sensory neural hearing loss, because most of the time it is missed. So, so what are the factors which influence the degree of affection? So how would you, like you already mentioned primary versus secondary, but what are the other factors, including these, that affect the outcome in this pregnancy?
Apart from primary versus secondary, then is the timing of an infection. Period of gestation at which the infection occurs is also an important factor. The infection can occur even in a periconceptional period. If woman has a CMV infection within 3 months, and still there are transmission rates ranging to around 9 to 10% in that situation. In case of a primary infection, the risk of infection is around 30 to 40%. And in case of a primary infection, it is around 30 to 40% in first trimester, and the long-term sequelae are also seen. In case of a third trimester, the transmission risk is around 40 to 50%, but no, the long-term sequelae are seen.
Right. So again, the recurring theme is that earlier the infection, more severe it is, later on the infection severity will come down. And so now, Dr. Manisha ma'am, I don't know how I've always been coming here for serology. This is not on purpose, I tell you, it just happened. So now, how do we interpret this serology? Because IgM is negative and IgG is positive, but the avidity is high. So how would you interpret this serology and conclusively diagnose maternal CMV infection?
So basically, we have to remember that since we have done this test and IgM has come as negative, then that means the infection has occurred earlier in gestation, not very near. But since IgG is positive, and as you said, avidity is also low, then that means the infection has occurred quite recently. So that is very clear from this test. And what was the other part?
No, so in this particular case, how would you definitively make a diagnosis
Yeah.
of CMV?
So basically, if we are getting some important findings on ultrasound and MRI, we already know where we are heading towards. So we will do naturally, we will do an amniocentesis and do PCR to confirm our diagnosis. With this, we will be able to tell definitely whether this baby is having CMV infection or not. So
Right.
that.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. And just one more thing here is that even if the avidity is high in this case, because this is 33 weeks, so infection could have occurred early on in this pregnancy and the avidity could become high. So in such cases where there are gross ultrasound findings or gross features of infection, even if, so we can suspect an infection in the first trimester. So, sir, how do you go about the, sonology, radiological diagnosis and amniocentesis? Definitely.
In fact, I would just point out one more thing, that if we are getting such findings on MRI and in ultrasound, then maybe we could have straight away gone for doing an invasive testing rather than going and doing the torch test. I mean, it would be more specific if we would do that.
Yeah.
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 So,
So, sir, what would you like to say to that?
So it's quite simple now. In this situation, it's very high. The avidity high means that it got hit at the worst possible time.
Before you go on, I would also like to ask about what Dr. Manisha said, that in this situation you could have directly gone for invasive without doing
Yes,
a maternal
or
torch.
not.
Any comments on that? Before, I would like to create some controversy here.
Well, actually, there isn't a controversy. It's a question of the way we look at invasive procedures. The point is that invasive procedures in hands like all of us on the panel here are not associated with complications. But to convince somebody about an invasive procedure, even if you tell them that the baby is going to get retarded, and that is what is going to happen in this case, not just a growth restriction, but a mental retardation, then we are in trouble. Now, the patient is going to take time to make up their mind for a few days. In that case, why not just do the serology anyway? So while you're waiting and you're checking
But
to
sir, yeah, but sir, we need to do this invasive, like we need to do some CMA or karyotyping in this case. So along with that, we can do this.
But by the time we're getting our patient ready and it's a Friday and I have to do it on Monday morning, then you say, okay, I'll do serology as well. And then I know that, yes, I will expect this. And there is no doubt that this diagnosis is going to come from serology, because that's how not from serology, but from invasive, because that's the only way to get a full diagnosis in this situation. The findings that I'm going to find are extremely destructive findings. And we find such extremely destructive findings with the periventricular cystic changes and this huge number of cortical abnormalities. I know already that even without an MRI, I'm going to be looking at a severe cytomegalovirus infestation of this fetus. There is no question about that. The question is, if I was in early pregnancy, I might have been confused about amniocentesis. Later in pregnancy, I know that this amniotic fluid is going to be loaded with viral DNA, so I'll have no trouble. But early in pregnancy, I must understand that to get viral DNA in amniotic fluid, I must have A, the fetus producing enough of this virus, and B, it should be producing enough urine to carry this virus out into the amniotic fluid. So in that situation, I look for at least 8 weeks after the maternal infection. And I prefer 20 weeks to do the amniocentesis, but some say, okay, let's do it at 18. But that 8 weeks is really important, because you could get a very, very encouraging result in early pregnancy. And actually that would be falsely reassuring. When I say early, the mid trimester. So therefore, we really have to be careful that these two things should be followed.
Right. Thank you, sir. So now, is there any role of, so now we've done the MRI and we did the MRI in this case, but is it like really needed? I think sir said it is a very clear-cut diagnosis and you don't need MRI, but what should the MRI be done?
Yeah, so we know that MRI gives us much better images, of course, only after 26 weeks. And so we are safe at this time to do a reasonable extraction of good information. When it comes to the analysis of the cortical migration disorders, we do understand that there's a large number of focal disorders that would actually be far better seen on an MRI, in which case I would really like to do an MRI in this situation. The rest of the things would be pretty much the same. Cystic fluid collections, you would pick up the same amount, but a lot of the rest of it the pachygyrias, the focal lesions, that we would pick up only on MRI.
Right. So thank you, sir. So Dr. Rashmi Bagga ma'am, so what are the prognostic indicators where we can, so this was actually an extreme case, but how would you go about prognosticating a patient whose infection has come positive?
See now, supposing, I mean, her PCR is positive, so the baby is infected, amniotic fluid. Is that what you are saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So now, whether the baby is affected or not, it's very difficult to make out. We have to only depend upon imaging, ultrasound and MRI. Like you said in the previous slide, they were both complementaries. So we keep watching. So if those are normal, in that case, we can reasonably reassure her the baby is not going to have a severe infection, but that will not rule out a sensory neural deafness, which is the commonest association of this, which will be picked up later on in life as the neonate grows. So if you get findings on ultrasound in the cranial findings and or MRI, the baby is to be severely affected. If not, less severely affected, but again to be evaluated in the neonatal period.
Right. So thank you, ma'am. So last question for this would be that Dr. Manisha, do you think there's any treatment for this? Have you given any experience, or how should we decide?
Yes, so for CMV infection, there has been a few reports. I was just going through it, and there has been some RCT also, and this valacyclovir has been found to be effective. But we need more studies. They have also said that you need a larger cohort, and this is a drug for herpes infection actually, which is being used and has been found to decrease infection. So they say that about 70% cases the infection decreased, and in those in which the infection occurred, then in those cases the severity of infection also decreased with this drug. So
this is in the nascent phase, and I don't think we can directly give it without more trials. But the category in which you would give is the mild to moderately symptomatic fetuses. In that, anyways, if it is severe, then you would want a termination or no interventions, and asymptomatic, you would definitely not intervene. So yes, sir.
One thing before we close this chapter on valacyclovir, there's no doubt that this fetus is severely affected, and it's we cannot terminate this pregnancy, but we'd like not to get this fetus destroyed further. So in this situation, we're really allowed to use this. There are two ways in which we can use valacyclovir. One is that loading dose that would kill the fetus because it's too much for the kidneys to handle, but we could do it in divided doses. And we have an excellent series out from the EVIL group last month, which says that it is truly a miracle drug that we ought to be using. And the numbers are not small in that series. Right. So, and it's available locally because the dermatologists have brought this in very beautifully into this country. So it's well worth really remembering that this drug is available.
In case we should definitely try it out.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and I'd like to tell that what happened to this case is that she delivered with us. The baby received compassionate care. She had serious adjustment issues with the baby that, the baby is not doing well. And unfortunately, she delivered in December and the baby died in February. So the baby did not do well in this particular case, which was kind of expected with such severe affection. So now we just have a rapid fire series. This is one is for Dr. Ashok Khurana sir and Dr. Manisha ma'am. So this is a 26-weeker, A positive, ICT negative. Ultrasound shows hydrops, MCA PSV is raised. So she's a non-immune hydrops with a raised MC PSV. So sir, which intrauterine infection you would like to implicate the cause?
Good old parvovirus B, of course.
Yeah. So, sir, if this patient is IgM and IgG positive, what will you do next?
Well, we do understand that this is not a straightforward disease as we used to believe it to be. And we cannot afford to ignore it. We used to think this was transient disease. And we used to dismiss it and say, baby will be fine, the anemia will be fine. That is not true anymore. We do understand that they have long-term implications in terms of development of the brain, not because of the fact that the parvovirus would get there, but because of the chronic effects of hypoxia as well as the eye drops. Also, that we do have a problem with cardiac functioning, and they could run into cardiomyopathies and a transplant. So it is something that we have to prognosticate carefully.
Right. So definitely yes, and we say that you monitor for 12 weeks.
Yes.
So, Dr. Manisha ma'am, how would you monitor this patient?
Yeah, so basically we have to just see that we tide over this infection. So we can do ultrasound every week or twice weekly also. And we can monitor and see the MCA PSV, whether it is rising or not. So if it becomes more than 1.5 MOM, then we can think of intrauterine transfusion. And say around 10, 12 weeks, we have to follow this patient till the times the infection subsides. So this
Right,
is
so-
what we're going to do.
Thank you. So this is actually a suppression of the erythroid precursors, which is a transient thing, although it can have a long-term outcome if there has been a severe anemia or hypoxia during the time of infection. So we need to be careful. And very recently we did an IUT for parvovirus infection and the baby came out fine. But yes, there was a severe anemia in the baby. So that was about parvovirus. And the next rapid fire is for Dr. Asmita ma'am and Dr. Rashmi Bagga ma'am, that this lady, ma'am, has started with chickenpox, so we end with chickenpox. Dr. Rashmi ma'am started her first comment with chickenpox. So she's a 32-year-old lady, primary gravida, 16 weeks, history of pruritic vesicular rash on the body, and she has chickenpox. So the patient has chickenpox. So this is the first scenario in which I would like you to answer. I will take the second scenario with Dr. Asmita ma'am. So the mother has chickenpox. So what is the risk of fetal infection?
So this is the time period when it's going to be highest, 13 to 20 weeks. This is the time when 2% chances of fetal infection are going to be there. As shown, if she was less than 13 weeks, it was 0.5%, and beyond 20 weeks, the baby is reasonably safe.
Right. And ma'am, how do you diagnose fetal infection?
Again, ultrasound, so amniotic amniocentesis and PCR to look for the
Right, in affection. And ma'am, is there a treatment for this?
see, if the patient gets chickenpox, if she's exposed to chickenpox or she gets chickenpox, then we give acyclovir very early. Acyclovir is a standard of care now in chickenpox, safe in pregnancy, and it is going to reduce the chances of the fetal varicella syndrome. That is given usually for a week. And if she's in contact, she hasn't yet developed chickenpox, then we give her the immunoglobulins to prevent it.
Yes, ma'am. So that's our next scenario for Dr. Asmita. So this
Sorry.
mother had exposure to child who has chickenpox. So ma'am, what will you do next?
We would ask her a history if she had chickenpox anytime in the past. If there is no history, then we can test whether she's an IgG positive for the chickenpox. If she's already immune, we don't need to do anything. But if she's not immune, then probably we need to observe her, and if she develops any, then we need to give her acyclovir post-exposure or immunoglobulins. But immunoglobulins are very expensive and probably not very easy available in all the situations. So we can consider acyclovir as a prophylaxis for say 1 week after the exposure.
Right. So thank you, ma'am. And I think this is very important because actually, as what ma'am said is, it's easy to write varicella immunoglobulin, but it is either very expensive or it is not available. So normally even people have suggested giving IVIG. But again, that's a rather random thing to do. So also at this point in time, the POG of exposure also becomes very important. If it is more than 20 weeks, anyway, the chances of fetal varicella syndrome is very, very less. So this is something that we need to consider before advising varicella immunoglobulin or acyclovir. So these parameters have to be really seen. So I think with that, we come to the end of this panel, and I think we are quite on time and we finished in 1 hour. So I really thank all my esteemed panelists for their comments and for all their input. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, Dr. Khurana. It was really nice to involve me. And like when she messaged me, I said, this torch is something you have to keep reading again and again, and still you forget it when it comes to actual management. So it was an excellent revision for us. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think that is something that all of us just keep following all the time. Every time we read this chapter, there is something new. And the first new thing is already in our question box. So should we start with the question box already, Dr. Parna?
Yes, sir, definitely.
We were supposed to actually have trade partner videos before that. Maybe we'll give them 5 minutes and then carry on with our questions.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, we'll do the trade partner. So there we are, all set for your questions. And I was mentioning that, it's so important to keep learning. Now, and this question is in the question box also about the dose of valacyclovir. So with your permission, Aparna, may I answer that question?
Yes, sir, please.
So the trial I was referring to was published in the Lancet last year, end of last year, 2020. And this was prospective, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And there were 92 participants and they were randomized. Most of them were earlier in pregnancy, close to 18 to 20 weeks. And follow-up amniocentesis showed much less yield of DNA from this, and some of them with no yield. And the overall outcome was also fairly decent. So it's really worth using. But what they did point out was that instead of giving them 8 grams as a single dose, which is very toxic for so many people, the fetus and the mother, it's 4 grams twice a day of the valacyclovir. And then now back to you for all the rest of the questions.
Right, sir. So I think the first question on toxoplasmosis was asked before we discussed toxoplasmosis. So I think that would be answered.
Yes.
Can we give acyclovir in pregnancy? So Dr. Asmita ma'am, would you like to answer, or anyone?
Yeah, it can be given in pregnancy. Cyclovir, even valacyclovir can be given. It's also just a variant of cyclovir. So both the drugs can be given.
Right, ma'am. Exactly. And it's a category B drug, so it can be given. Reference lab for torch infection, sir. Would you like to say something about it? Can you suggest a reference lab for torch infection?
There are a lot of places that call themselves reference labs, but they're not reference labs for toxoplasmosis. And the list is truly very small. Even in a place like Delhi, we actually have only the Dr. Sarman Singh's lab at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So it's really a regional thing. The good news is that COVID has made us very smart, and we can get our courier to actually send these across, and they will be received at AIMS by their staff on duty, and we can get results from there. There is a longish turnover time. It's not something that happens in 3 days or 4 days, and it does take 7 to 10 days, but at least when push comes to shove on these borderline situations, we can really try and get a correct message from there.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir. So, Dr. Manisha, I would like to come to you for serology again.
May I just interrupt?
Yes.
PGI is also a reference.
Yes.
Oh, very nice. Yeah.
PGI channel.
That's
Yes,
nice.
yes.
Nice.
And they're doing PCR in-house also, amniocentesis, with a lot of keen interest in that.
Right. So thank you for bringing that up, ma'am. So Dr. Manisha, what is considered a significant rise in IgG titers?
Yeah, like I said, in 2 to 3 weeks, there should be a 4-fold rise. So that is called a significant rise of IgG.
Right. So thank you.
So 4-fold rise in 3 weeks. Yeah.
4-fold rise has to be there. So the other thing is, Dr. Rashmi ma'am, would you advise a torch if the patient has fever for 3 days without any rash in the first trimester?
Now, actually, see, if there is no symptom, the answer is no. But Dr. Khurana very elegantly pointed out that later on, if something comes up and you have missed it, and somebody is judging you, how are you going to justify that? So I'll take the history very carefully. What kind of fever it is? Does it have any reason for it? It settle down. And if the patient insists, I may not hesitate. I wanted to say that.
Right.
Yes.
So thank you, ma'am. Dr. Asmita ma'am, there is this question is that I think we have answered that question repeatedly also. So I think I'll just quickly go through that question, that if the patient is only IgM positive without any history of symptoms, should we repeat serology after 2 weeks? Yes, to see for seroconversion. So if it is IgG negative, that means that she is susceptible. And also if in 2 weeks there is seroconversion happening, then there is a possibility of acute torch infection, or it was a false positive IgM. Now, Dr. Asmita ma'am, I'll come to this question for you. She's a 6th gravida with isoimmunized with history of 3 hydropic babies, isoimmunized, ICT positive. Now, has torch also coming positive? So will you give importance to that in the counseling? Ma'am, you have to unmute.
You have to unmute, yes.
Well, it's a difficult situation, but when she's an isoimmunized, I would put more as an isoimmunization as a cause for hydrops in this pregnancy. And IgG, which infection she has come positive as?
She's come as all TORCH IgG positive.
IgG
All IgG positive. All IgG positive. See, we do get such reports.
No,
So-
but all IgG positive, it means it's anyway a past infection and unlikely to have any impact on this current finding of an hydrops. So she
Right.
should be treated more as an isoimmunized pregnancy.
Right. Sir, this is this question that if it is rubella IgG and IgM positive at 20 weeks and avidity is high, can we rule out an infection during pregnancy?
No, we rule it in.
Yes, it is possible.
Yes, because then you know that it happened in early pregnancy.
Yes, and then we do
One
an
more
amniocentesis.
question, to the previous question, when we have that high drops, if we were ever going to do a choreocentesis on that baby to try and figure out, or before a transfusion for whatever reason, it would be a great idea to actually look for thrombocytopenia, because a lot of these infections as well as parvo result in thrombocytopenia, and that can have a tremendous effect on fetal outcomes. So in that situation, it's a good idea beyond your routine testing on that choreocentesis sample to also assess for fetal thrombocytopenia.
Right. Thank you, sir, for that pointer. So there is this 18-weeker with IUGR with placentomegaly, HSV, both IgG and IgM positive like our case. So this is very similar to the first case that I talked about, except that it is 18 instead of 28. Mother is asymptomatic. What next? Fetus shows no positive features. Dr. Rashmi, ma'am, are you there?
Yeah, I am there. I'm there. My connection was poor, so I put the video off.
Yeah.
See, if somebody comes by 18 weeks, what were the features? Can you just point out?
She has IUGR, placentomegaly, and HSV is positive.
Yeah, so I would like to do an amniocentesis and do both the things. I would look for aneuploidy also as well as for torch infections and see what I pick up.
Yeah, so
That
I think in
is-
this
yeah,
particular,
yeah.
yes. So in this particular case, the HSV transmission in pregnancy is very, very rare. So HSV is,
Yeah, that is
it is,
at time of delivery mainly.
yes.
So we
yes.
are really not concerned about HSV positive at this
Yeah.
point, but you have in ultrasound features to tell you that she needs an invasive testing,
Definitely.
and then it's a good idea to look for both.
Yes.
And one more thing, Aparna, I wanted to just give a practice point. A lot of women, like you said, with recurrent abortions and all, they get their torch done and they will come with some positive, this or that. So a simple rule of thumb is that if somebody has any acute infection, hold on for 6 months. It's likely to pass off on its own, and any secondary infection is less likely to infect the fetus than a primary infection. That
Right.
is one more practical point which I have seen.
Yeah, absolutely, ma'am. So,
Yeah,
sir, I would like to take this question with you, that CMV in the preconceptional period who's having secondary infertility,
Mhm.
would you treat it?
We've never known to have an association between infertility and CMV infection.
Yeah.
And the question then is, should we treat it as a preconceptional condition? But we just keep a watch on those titers and see how they behave. And if they go up, then we presume that she has a CMV infection, and then we will treat it. But there is no pressure, but it's certainly not the cause of infertility.
Definitely not. And I think that's a very good point, that we look at the titers and, the thing, whether it's a recent infection, old infection, do you really need to treat it? Is it an acute infection? So those are the considerations here before we start treating them. So I think
2 or 3 more interesting questions, which I picked up right in the middle here.
Okay, I
And
missed
there was
something.
this question of Dr. Demasmita has asked this. That,
Yes, I was just up to that question. Sometimes we get mild signs of infection in ultrasound, like calcifications or septated cystic choroid plexus, but we don't get a history from patients properly to get the window period to decide invasive. So what to do? Should we depend on maternal torch? So, sir, would you like to take this question?
I firmly believe that you sit down with the patient's file and you sit down with the patient's relatives and you can find all the clues. They will have some backside or some paper that will let you know exact windows. Once you have that calendar worked out, you can then decide everything. But when in doubt and you're comfortable with your invasive procedures, just do the invasive procedure. It really works out very well with appropriate counseling. So you have to look at your own situation, but I still like to sit down with every single file, every single piece of paper, irrespective of how it is arranged. And I always find clues inside that.
Right, sir. I think that's very important to review the history. And also, Dr. Debaswita, I would like to say that, see, 18 to 20 weeks is a situation when the fetus is actually producing urine. And if the virus is there, it will get excreted. So I think that is another important thing to see. Definitely, we don't know exactly where the infection happened, but after 18 weeks, if there has been even some of the things and your IgG is coming positive or your IgM is, IgG titers are increasing. So that means that there has been a certain time of infection to the fetus, to the baby. So it is good to do amniocentesis around that time whenever you are picking it up. So those are certain features. Again, as sir said, when was her first IgM positive, when was her IgG positive? So all of those things will definitely help you, decide these things. And somebody really wants to say that the panel should have gone slow. I am already dying that we took maybe 7 minutes more. But yes, sir,
Yeah.
as people are repeatedly asking, that
Yes.
the recording will be available so you can see it at your own pace. So really sorry for that, for rushing through some of the slides.
Well, the good news is that almost all our webinars, provided there are no copyright issues, you will find them in 2 locations, either on the website in the members section, but even more commonly than that, we actually have a YouTube channel which belongs to the Society of Fetal Medicine, where all within a period of 3 to 6 to 8 weeks at most, we actually put up every single webinar that we ever do. And you will find it there. And you will find the announcement in the WhatsApp groups. And you will find that you just click on that and you get to our YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is what I suggest all of you do. You go to any of the webinars that we throw into the WhatsApp group, subscribe, you like, because if you like, then we know that we can at least become self-sustaining. And then you will get notifications. The moment you get notifications, you can keep knowing what has come on, including today's webinar. This would be within, you would be able to see that. So I think you will have no trouble in going through that. We are also looking very carefully into what time we allot to each webinar. We do realize a lot of people log out after an hour and a half. And so I think we might reduce the content and go at a slower pace. And sometimes we'll have more content, sometimes we'll have less. But we'd like to give a lot of autonomy to whoever does our programs, and so we go by that. But you can listen to this as many times as you want and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out any of this. Every single state has a WhatsApp group. So the YouTube channel is called the SFM YouTube channel. And for those of you who have any trouble in this, you can contact Vishal Mittal, who is always there on our programs, and you have his number on our website. Be in touch with him and he will guide you through the process of actually reaching that.
Dr. Khurana, sir, may I add something?
Yes.
I'm sorry I wasn't there in the beginning. Means I was there, but I couldn't speak. You couldn't hear me.
Yes.
So actually, this is our 8th episode, but only 3 episodes are there on the YouTube channel. 4 have yet to come. So it's 4 months already. This is the 5th month.
Correct.
So something has to be done about it because they're very slow in coming online.
That's right. You see, we've had to make sure that every single piece of advertising gets edited. We also have to speak and get permission from our speakers. And some of our speakers are fairly slow in replying to our emails. So which is why we have a delay. And then we got COVID in Delhi. And so that's what has happened. So we've now cleared the March.
COVID everywhere.
Yes. So we've cleared the March backlog and we're up to now about the end of March. And I think by the end of July, we will be completely up to date.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
But we look forward to fabulous programs in association with the Raipur Obs and Gynae Society. And for those of us who are from other societies and are tuned in today, you know that the Society of Fetal Medicine facilitates programs with any society. Our main idea is to promote teamwork, to make sure that we're all on the same page, and to make sure that we all think alike and learn from each other. And therefore, please feel quite free to be in touch with the office bearers in your area or with the central office and go ahead and organize all this for us. Dr. Aparna, last words from you before we hand over for the thanks.
Thank you so much, sir, for and SFM for this opportunity. And I'm really, really thankful to all the panelists for their expert comments and inputs, which all coming from their vast experience. So thank you again so much, and thank you Raipur Society for having us again and again. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Aparna. I think you are an honorary member of Raipur Society now. We've had the meeting so often, so very often now. This is the 8th episode and you have been on each of them, and I thank you very much, and Dr. Khurana sir, for making these webinars such that they are really premium. Today, at one point, we had more than 320 people. So, people really log in and look forward to these. So I thank Khurana sir and Aparna madam. Also the guests for today evening, Dr. Manisha Kumar, Dr. Asmita Rathod, Dr. Rashmi Bagga. I thank all our viewers and Vishal for actually getting everything done so very smoothly that nobody feels the pain except maybe the panelists who have to study hard for a new topic every day. And thank you, sir, for having fantabulous topics. And now that you've reduced the time, I think we are attracting more people. So thanks for that as well. And good night. Thank you.
A pleasure.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.